Calling the virtual equals method to check for equality has one problem. What happens if, for a reference type, one or both of the references you want to compare might be null? I'll go back to the food code and put food back to being a class, and then in the main method I'll replace these equals calls with a single call to equals on banana, passing null as the argument, and display the result. And if I compile and run that, you can see that returns false. That makes perfect sense, because clearly null is not the same as a non-null instance. And that, by the way, is a principle of equality in .NET. Null should never evaluate as equal to a non-null value. But if there was a possibility that the first parameter might be null, then we have a problem. Imagine instead of having these variables hard-coded, we'd been given them by some other code, and we didn't know if either value was null. If banana was null, this line would throw a null reference exception, because you can't call methods against null instances. This is the problem that the static equals method is designed to solve. To use it, I can just say objects.equals and then pass both values as parameters. So now I can make either parameter null and run that. And you can see that runs fine. Both results show that null is not equal to banana, which is what you'd expect. You may wonder what happens if both arguments are null. Let's try that. I'll pass two nulls to the static equals method, and if we run that, you can see that returns true. In fact, as far as .NET is concerned, null always equals null, so testing whether null equals null should always return true. If anyone uses SQL, you'll be aware that this is not how SQL works. SQL nulls are rather more complicated, but comparing null with null in SQL does not return true. Internally, the static equals method is very simple. I've put some code on the slide, which I've written to show the logic of what you'd see if you looked at the actual IL for the method. It first checks whether the two parameters refer to the same object. That's what the equals equals operator will do. This check will also pick up and return true if both parameters are null. The next statement will cause the method to return false if just one of the parameters is null and the other is not null. And finally, if we hit the else clause, then we know that both parameters point to actual instances, so we can just call the virtual equals method. This means that the static equals method will always give exactly the same result as the virtual method, except that it checks for nulls first. In particular, because the static method calls the virtual method, if you override the virtual equals method, your override will automatically be picked up by the static method. That's important because you want these two methods to behave consistently.